Honda, their 2020 season began with a single moment that destroyed everything. At Jerez, Marc Marquez produced what looked like another miracle ride. He ran wide, saved a near crash by riding through the gravel at ridiculous lean angles, and rejoined the track. Commentators screamed. It was the kind of physics-defying save only Marquez could do. But a few laps later, pushing as if nothing had happened, he high-sided violently at turn 3. His body slammed into the asphalt. His arm snapped, and with it, Honda's future snapped too. Surgeons inserted a titanium plate, and just days later, Marquez insisted on returning. Against medical advice, he tried to ride again in the following race. His arm couldn't take it. The plate broke, the injury worsened, and suddenly Honda were left without their savior for the rest of the season. That's when the reality hit. The RC213V was not a competitive bike without Marc's brilliance. Alex Marquez, a rookie, inherited the impossible job of leading the factory team. He scraped 2 second-place finishes, brave rides that showed his grit, but the rest of the campaign was a disaster. The Honda bucked, slid, and punished its riders. Cal Crutchlow and Taka Nakagami battled injury after injury on the satellite Hondas. Stefan Bradl was drafted in as a test rider turned racer, but couldn't drag the bike anywhere near the front. For the first time in decades, Honda went winless in a full season. The team that had built dynasties with Mick Doohan, Valentino Rossi, and Marquez was suddenly exposed. Without Marc, there was no plan B. What had been the strongest manufacturer in MotoGP history slumped to their worst constructor's result of the modern 4-stroke era. The paddock whispered what everyone already knew. Honda had built a bike for one man, and when he fell, the empire collapsed. Suzuki, their 2022 season began with quiet optimism. In 2020, Joan Mir had stunned the paddock by winning the World Championship. In 2021, they weren't as strong, but still competitive, with Alex Rins often showing podium pace. By the time 2022 rolled around, the factory seemed stable, their GSX-RRA balanced, forgiving machine, admired by riders across the grid. It wasn't the fastest, but it was consistent. Fans expected more wins. What they didn't expect was betrayal. In May, only a handful of races into the season, news leaked from the paddock. Suzuki were pulling out of MotoGP, not at the end of a contract, not gradually, immediately, at the end of 2022. No warning to their riders, no hint to their mechanics. It hit like a bombshell. Alex Rins and Joan Mir learned from the media that the team they had committed their careers to was gone. The timing made it even more brutal. Rins was riding brilliantly, fighting for podiums. Mir was consistent, still among the best young talents in the sport. The garage atmosphere collapsed overnight. Mechanics wept, engineers were furious, and morale evaporated. Rins later admitted that finding motivation became almost impossible. Mir said the betrayal felt personal. On track, results nosedived. Rins crashed repeatedly, partly from overpushing, partly from bad luck. Mir seemed a shadow of himself, stuck in the midfield. By mid-season, the factory that had just been world champions 2 years earlier looked like they had already checked out. The final insult came in November at Valencia. Rins pulled off a defiant victory, the last ever MotoGP race for Suzuki. It was bittersweet, a glorious farewell on paper, but in reality, it was a funeral procession. Fans were left bewildered. How could a factory walk away at its competitive peak? The brutality of Suzuki's 2022 season wasn't just in the results. It was the shock exit, the abandonment of 2 riders in their prime, and the sense of waste. A manufacturer that had built history, that had returned to the top, vanished in an instant. For the paddock, it was a reminder that in MotoGP, money and politics can kill dreams as easily as a crash can. Ducati, if Honda's fall was sudden, and Yamaha's was political, Ducati's 2011 was pure heartbreak. They had just signed Valentino Rossi, the biggest name in MotoGP, the man who had transformed Yamaha into winners. Fans expected Rossi to repeat the miracle in red, to bring Ducati their first consistent title fight since Casey Stoner in 2007. Instead, they got humiliation. From the first test, the problems were obvious. The Desmosedici refused to turn. Its unconventional frameless chassis design, with carbon elements and a stiff front end, made it a nightmare to ride. Rossi's trademark flowing style was destroyed. He wrestled the bike, slid wide, and never looked comfortable. Every weekend became the same grim cycle. Rossi qualified poorly, spent the race stuck in mid-pack, and crossed the line seconds behind the leaders. By mid-season, the panic had set in. Ducati engineers scrambled to bring endless updates. New chassis, new swing arms, new electronics, but nothing worked. Casey Stoner, who had left Ducati for Honda that year, dominated the championship and won the title on the bike Rossi could only dream of riding. The contrast was brutal. One man showed how good the rider-bike connection mattered, while Rossi and Ducati looked lost in the wilderness. The stats were shocking. No wins, only one podium. For Rossi, the 2011 season was the first winless campaign of his MotoGP career. For Ducati, it was proof that throwing money and talent at a problem doesn't guarantee success. The Rossi era, which was supposed to be a rebirth, instead became the team's most painful year. Fans who expected the Doctor in Red to create history were left watching a broken partnership limp from race to race. 2011 didn't just hurt Ducati's reputation, it broke their mystique. For years afterward, the shadow of Rossi's failure hung over the Bologna factory, a reminder that sometimes, even the greatest rider in history can't fix a fundamentally flawed machine. Yamaha. While Honda's collapse was dramatic, Yamaha's season was humiliating. Their problems weren't as obvious as a broken arm. They were systemic, political, and technical. Fabio Quartararo, riding for the satellite Petronas Yamaha team, opened the season brilliantly. He won the first two races at Jerez and looked like a future world champion. But cracks in the project appeared almost immediately. Yamaha's engine supplier had delivered motors with faulty valves. By mid-season, they were running dangerously close to failure. To cover themselves, Yamaha quietly swapped valve suppliers, a move that broke FIM regulations. The punishment was brutal. Yamaha were docked team and constructors' points, and their reputation took a public beating. Meanwhile, the on-track struggles grew worse. Quartararo's blistering early pace disappeared, his title challenge collapsing under the weight of engine penalties and inconsistent results. Maverick Vinales looked unbeatable on Fridays, but every Sunday the bike betrayed him with poor launches, erratic electronics, and fading grip. Valentino Rossi endured one of his worst years, multiple DNFs, crashes, and a COVID-19 diagnosis that kept him out of races altogether. By season's end, Yamaha had no championship, no morale, and a garage split in politics between the factory team and the satellite squad that looked more competitive. Quartararo had been hailed as the savior, but his form faded. Rossi quietly announced his time at Yamaha was ending. Vinales voiced open frustration with the team's inability to fix its chronic problems. The 2020 season was Yamaha's lowest moment in the modern four-stroke era. Instead of fighting Honda and Ducati for the crown, they were embarrassed by Suzuki, a smaller factory with half the resources. Yamaha ended the year not as contenders, but as the sport's cautionary tale, a giant undone not by one crash, but by poor engineering and internal chaos. LCR Honda. By 2016, LCR Honda had pinned everything on Cal Crutchlow. The British rider was tough, aggressive, and had the guts to ride a twitchy bike on the edge. But the RC213V that year was notorious. The front end was unpredictable, the electronics crude compared to Yamaha's and Ducati's, and unless you were Marc Marquez, you were always fighting a losing battle. The season began with humiliation. In Qatar, Crutchlow retired. In Argentina, he went down again. In Austin, another DNF. By Jerez, the fourth round, his points tally was still 0. Race after race, he either binned it pushing too hard or limped home way off the pace. Commentators joked that Cal was crashing for science, testing the limits of a Honda no one could tame. But for the team, there was no laughter. It was their worst start in years, with sponsors quietly asking what had gone wrong. The frustration ate at Crutchlow. He lashed out at Honda in interviews, saying the bike was designed for Marquez alone, leaving everyone else to suffer. The LCR garage, usually a tight-knit unit, carried the weight of a sinking season. Mechanics worked overtime, fitting endless small updates, but the same problems repeated. Weak front grip, savage engine braking, crashes in identical corners week after week. Then came Brno. Rain mixed up the grid, and suddenly, chaos opened the door. Crutchlow gambled on harder wet tires while the rest of the field played it safe. Lap by lap, he carved through the pack, overtaking world champions with audacious moves. Against all odds, he crossed the line first. It was historic. Cal Crutchlow became the first Brit to win a MotoGP race since Barry Sheene in 1981, and LCR finally had their miracle moment. But that single day couldn't erase the reality of the season. Outside of Brno, the story was still crashes, DNFs, and inconsistency. Even with a late-season win in Australia, Australia, the damage was done. LCR's 2016 was brutal because it showed the team at rock bottom for half a year, mocked in the standings, and saved only by 2 flashes of brilliance. Without those miracles, it might have gone down as their absolute worst season ever. Aprilia, their return to MotoGP in 2015, was supposed to be a proud moment. The Italian factory had history, titles in 125cc and 250cc, a reputation for producing technical wizardry, but their comeback turned into one of the most brutal embarrassments in Premier Class history. The bike they brought, the RSGP, wasn't a proper MotoGP prototype. It was essentially a modified World Superbike rushed into service years before it was ready. From the moment Alvaro Bautista and Marco Melandri swung a leg over it, they knew they were in trouble. The RSGP was heavy, underpowered, and unstable. It lacked the braking stability needed to fight in MotoGP. Electronics were outdated. Top speed was so low that Aprilia's bikes were eaten alive on straights. Bautista fought hard, but often finished seconds off the leaders, clinging to 14th or 15th place. Melandri, a former race winner, was humiliated. He trailed at the very back, sometimes over a lap down. By mid-season, his frustration boiled over. He walked away from the project, quitting MotoGP entirely. For Aprilia, the optics were brutal. They had returned to the world's biggest stage, only to look like amateurs. Other factories lapped them, literally. Commentators joked that the Aprilias were fighting not for points, but just to avoid embarrassment. The RSGP became the paddock's punchline. Behind the scenes, engineers scrambled. Updates came, but none fixed the core problems. Aprilia simply weren't ready. By the end of the season, they were last in the constructors' standings, finishing behind satellite Yamaha and Ducati teams, behind even the low-budget privateers. The brutality of 2015 wasn't just Aprilia's results, it was the damage to their reputation. For years afterward, fans and rivals dismissed them as irrelevant. Their name, once respected in the smaller classes, became synonymous with failure in MotoGP. It would take nearly a decade for Aprilia to claw their way back to respectability. KTM. When KTM entered MotoGP in 2017, the hype was massive. The Austrian powerhouse had dominated Moto3 and Moto2. Their slogan, "Ready to Race," had become legend in the paddock. Fans expected fireworks. What they got was a brutal education in the realities of the Premier Class. Pol Espargaro and Bradley Smith, both hardworking and aggressive riders, were given the first RC16 machines. From the start, the gap to the leaders was enormous. At Qatar, the debut race, the KTM bikes qualified on the last row, over 2 seconds slower than pole position. In race pace, it was worse. They fought not with Honda or Yamaha, but with the tail end of the grid, often finishing just ahead of weaker satellite bikes. Race after race, the humiliation continued. The KTM lacked top speed, corner stability, and braking confidence. The electronics were undeveloped. The riders wrestled just to keep the bikes upright. Finishing in the points was celebrated as if it were a podium. Espargaro said openly that the bike needed a miracle to catch the competition. The team didn't quit. Every race weekend, they brought updates. New frames, new exhausts, endless test parts. Progress came painfully slow. By the end of the season, they had closed the gap somewhat, occasionally sneaking into the top 10. But the 2017 statistics told the truth. 0 podiums, 0 real threats. A season spent learning through pain. For KTM, 2017 was the worst season, not because of embarrassment, but because of how brutally MotoGP exposed them. Dominance in junior classes meant nothing here. Against Honda, Yamaha, and Ducati, they were humbled, destroyed, and forced to rebuild. It was their baptism of fire, and it nearly broke them. But it also lit the fire that eventually made KTM competitive years later. Pramac Ducati. They entered 2014 as the official B team for Ducati, a squad designed to give extra track time to test parts and support the factory's fight back to relevance. On paper, they had a strong lineup. Andrea Iannone, a young Italian with raw speed, and Yanni Hernandez, the hard-charging Colombian. But the year unfolded as a perfect storm of injuries, inconsistency, and technical frustration. Andrea Iannone showed the first signs of his trademark style that season. Wild, fearless, and often too aggressive. He qualified well at several rounds, regularly putting the Pramac Ducati on the second or third row. At Mugello, the Italian fans roared as he ran near the front early on, teasing the possibility of a Ducati fairy tale. But the Desmosedici still had its infamous front-end issues, and Iannone's riding style only amplified them. Too many times he pushed too hard, too early, and ended races in the gravel. By the mid-season, his crash tally was among the highest on the grid. Hernandez had the opposite problem. He wasn't crashing, but he rarely had the outright pace to fight for the top 10. He spent most Sundays in no man's land, too fast for the backmarkers, but nowhere near the leaders. For a team hoping to be Ducati's shadow squad, that anonymity was damning. The real frustration came with development. Pramac, as Ducati's satellite, expected a steady stream of updates, but the factory was pouring resources into the GP14 and testing everything with Andrea Dovizioso and Cal Crutchlow. Pramac were often stuck running half versions of upgrades, or waiting races before receiving them. The result was a season where their riders were fighting with outdated bikes, while the factory squad slowly climbed out of its own slump. Injuries compounded the pain. Iannone missed races after heavy falls, and Hernandez was forced to carry the flag alone. Substitute riders filled in at times, further breaking continuity and robbing the team of rhythm. The garage atmosphere became deflated, mechanics joking grimly that simply finishing races without DNFS felt like victories. By the end of 2014, Pramac's results were bleak. No podiums, no real breakthroughs, and a growing reputation as Ducati's forgotten squad. The stats told the story. Inconsistent points finishes, no headline results, and a year that made sponsors question whether the satellite program was even worth it. For Pramac, 2014 was brutal, not because they were completely hopeless, but because they were invisible. They weren't terrible, but they weren't memorable either. And for a satellite team, that's the worst place to be. Irrelevant in a season where everyone else made headlines. Tech 3. They entered the 2015 season as Yamaha's loyal satellite squad, carrying a proud history of occasionally embarrassing the factories with podiums and giant killing performances. Riders like Ben Spies, Cal Crutchlow, and Andrea Dovizioso had delivered shocks in earlier years. In 2015, the lineup looked promising. Pol Espargaro, the fiery young Spaniard who had won the Moto2 championship, and Bradley Smith, the consistent Brit with a knack for long-run pace. Many expected Tech 3 to be the best of the rest. Instead, the year turned into their most forgettable season in a decade. From the opening round in Qatar, the cracks were obvious. Rossi and Lorenzo dominated on the factory Yamahas, showing just how good the M1 could be when fully developed. But Paul and Bradley didn't get that version. As a satellite team, Tech 3's Yamahas were always a step behind, missing key upgrades and engine evolutions. On Fridays, they sometimes looked competitive. By Sunday, the difference was brutal. Both riders would start strong, hang with the lead group for a handful of laps, and then drift backward, swallowed by Ducatis, Hondas, and even satellite outfits with better support. Paul's frustration was clear. Aggressive by nature, he pushed the Tech 3 Yamaha beyond its limits. The result was a season of over-lean moments, front-end saves, and too many crashes. He spoke openly in interviews about the lack of technical parity with the factory team. His confidence, once high after a bright Moto2 career, took a beating. Bradley Smith, on the other hand, played the long game. He didn't crash as often, kept his head down, and targeted consistent finishes. That kept him higher in the standings than Paul, but it didn't win fans or headlines. He looked solid, but unspectacular. The kind of rider who finished 7th or 8th, invisible in highlight reels. For a satellite squad whose identity was built on upsetting giants, that anonymity was perhaps the cruelest result. Race after race, the narrative stayed the same. At Mugello, the factory Yamahas soared, while Tech 3 fought the midfield. At Silverstone, Smith salvaged pride with a strong ride in tricky conditions, but it was an exception, not the rule. Paul had flashes of speed, but never the consistency to challenge for podiums. The team's morale sagged. Mechanics who had once celebrated surprise results now seemed resigned to mediocrity. By season's end, Tech 3 had not scored a single podium. Their points tally looked respectable on paper. Smith even finished 6th in the championship through sheer consistency, but their impact was zero. No breakthroughs, no glory. For Tech 3, 2015 was brutal, not because of embarrassment at the back of the grid, but because they disappeared. For a team built on shocking the big names, becoming invisible was the cruelest punishment. Avintia Bluesens. If LCR 2016 was about false hope and frustration, Avintia's 2012 was sheer survival. This was the height of the CRT experiment, the claiming rule teams introduced by Dorna to bulk up MotoGP's shrinking grid. The idea was noble, cheaper engines and chassis to allow private teams to enter. power. The reality was cruel. Avintia's bikes were underpowered, overweight, and unreliable. Their Kawasaki-based engines screamed loudly, but lacked top speed. On the straights, the factory Hondas and Yamahas blew past them like they were parked. In the corners, the CRT chassis flexed and buckled, leaving riders with no confidence. It wasn't racing. It was enduring. Riders like Ivan Silva and Yanni Hernandez were given the impossible task of making these machines competitive. Every weekend, they lined up at the very back. Within a handful of laps, they were already seconds per lap slower than the leaders. On television, they barely featured, except when being lapped. Race commentators sometimes apologized for not mentioning them at all, because there was nothing to say. The statistics were damning. Point finishes only came when half the grid crashed out. DNFs piled up from mechanical failures. On some weekends, both bikes failed to even see the checkered flag. Fans derided the CRT project as MotoGP in name only, and Avintia bore the brunt of that scorn. The team didn't quit. Mechanics patched engines together. Riders risked everything to at least fight the other CRT squads. And finishing ahead of the likes of PBM or Iota Racing was treated like a victory. But the image stuck. Avintia were backmarkers, moving obstacles for the real racers. 2012 was brutal because it branded Avintia with a reputation they struggled to shake for years. Even as MotoGP evolved and CRT rules were phased out, the memory lingered. The year when they were mocked as little more than chicanes on wheels. For a team desperate to prove they belong, 2012 was their lowest, most punishing chapter.